to remain part of literary culture. I fell in love with literary culture. I fell in love with the idea of writers, bookstores, publishers, what that all meant. It became a very heroic thing for me. So the whole idea of owning a bookstore took root right around that time, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I would travel long distances to go visit these iconic stores. I remember one time when I was in college, this is sort of a funny story, I went to City Lights, and this was in probably 1975, and I was 20. And I have a sister who's 8 years younger than me, she was 12. And my parents were taking my sister out to San Francisco just as kind of a Thanksgiving trip. And I said, well, I'll meet you there, because I want to go see City Lights. So I drove across the mountains, met my parents in San Francisco with my 12-year-old sister. We're browsing in City Lights bookshop, and I look to my left, and there's Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso both browsing right there in the bookshop. I said, wow, that's pretty amazing. And then I looked, and there was a poster that said that night there was going to be a reading, a dual reading with Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso. They were going to do dueling haikus, they said. So both of them were going to be on stage. One would read a poem, and then the next one would read a poem. So I said to my parents and my 12-year-old sister, let's go. So we went. It was really the first Ginsberg reading I'd ever been to be honest, and the first Corso reading. If any of you have ever heard Allen Ginsberg read, you know that he's extremely graphic in what he writes about. He was an openly gay writer, and he wrote extremely graphic homoerotic poems. So his first one is about a 15-minute homoerotic graphic poem with my 12-year-old sister, my mother sitting over here, and my father right next to her. I'm like, it's really, really rough. But it was redeemed when the poem is over. Corso, who is very rough-talking, New York writer, he goes, Ginsberg, I hope I can use a profanity. He said, Ginsberg, you read your fuck poem, I'm going to read mine. He said, when I was 12, I wanted to bite Sheila Finkelstein on the ass. That was the end of the book. And we'll go further. So the reading, that was the tenor of the reading. It finishes, I look around, my father stands up, my mother stands up, they give him a standing ovation. My 12-year-old sister, I think it changed her life. But it was completely one of those redeeming experiences. So that was my experience with the City Lights bookshop. And then, not too long afterwards, happened to have a chance to go to the Gotham Book Mart in New York. This was about the next year. And I was up there browsing in the Gotham Book Mart when I heard he's here. And I remember asking, who's he? And apparently, what would happen is Jorge Luis Borges, whenever he was blind toward the end of his life, whenever he would be in New York, the manager of the Gotham Book Mart would read to him, would literally read to him. And Borges was there in the bookshop being read to by the manager of the Gotham Book Mart. And I wanted to protect his privacy, but I was kind of trying to get as close as I could to where I thought they were. I got a glimpse of him, but I never really heard the reading. But it was really thrilling to kind of be in that close proximity to one of the giants of literary culture. Now, this was all before I was about 21. And, Edward Albee, I don't know how many of you read The Zoo Story by Edward Albee, but he has one character say to the other character in that story. In that play, he says, sometimes you have to go a long way out of your way to come back a short distance properly. And that's what happened to me. I wanted to do a bookstore, but I didn't even know what sales tax was. So I didn't know how I was going to do a bookstore, even though I knew I wanted to do a bookstore. So what did I do? I did what every other English major in America did in 1976. I went to law school. I went to law school in Washington, D.C., small law school called Antioch School of Law. And I found myself more in the bookstores there than I was in the law library. So that cemented for me the idea that I got to get out of the law business, I got to do what I really want to do. And so I drifted back down to Miami. It's a fluke, it's where my family lived. I dropped out of law school, came back, had no career, no way of earning a living. So I enrolled at the University of Miami and I got a master's degree in English and education so I could teach while I was learning the book trade. So while I was in school, I worked part-time in a B. Dalton bookstore in the Omni, the old Omni downtown. And I taught high school for about 2 years while I was developing the bookshop. I taught at Southridge High School. I taught English for 2.5, 3 years. And I loved it. But teaching English at that time was not an easy thing to be doing. So while I was doing that, I had decided that I would try to open a bookshop. And so I opened a very small bookshop in Coral Gables, the one that Les is talking about. It was 500 square feet. And at the time I opened it, I was also still teaching. And I said to myself, if I can pay myself a salary commensurate with what I was making as a teacher, I'll give up teaching and I'll continue in the bookshop alone. Well, fortunately, I was making so little as a teacher. That wasn't a real high bar to have to cross. I think at the time with a master's degree, I was earning $10,000 a year as a teacher. So fortunately, that's changed a little bit since then. So I was able to go full-time into the bookshop. And I did that in 1982. And as Les talks about, that very first bookshop in Coral Gables was very small. It was only about 500 square feet. But from the really very, very beginning, we were able to make an impact in the community. We had open poetry readings that people would be flowing out of the doors. We had author events, and we even started a very small literary magazine back then called the Palmetto Review. Two editions. If you have them, they're pretty rare, I think. Miami back in 1982 was just emerging from a really bleak period, as Les says. Mariel had just happened 2 years before. Haiti was in disarray. Drugs were everywhere. The whole idea of the cocaine cowboys was not a myth. It was happening all over town. People were getting shot up everywhere. But because of this, because Miami was in really kind of disarray, a small bookshop like ours could really kind of make a difference. One of our very first readings was with Isaac Singer, the Nobel Prize-winning Yiddish writer. He was a remarkable guy. He was this real. And are you still reading Isaac Singer in college these days? You are, great. He was this amazing throwback to another period, but he had a feisty sense of humor that was pretty remarkable. The very first time that I was with him, our bookshop was too small for all the people that came, so there were about 100 books left of his collected stories that I took up to this small apartment in Surfside that he was living in. And I gave him a little ballpoint pen to sign with. He looked at that pen and studied it, and it was as if it were the rarest thing in the world. I think he was kind of making fun of the fact that I gave him a little ballpoint pen. But then he told me this story, which I'll never forget. He said that he had just come from a book signing in New York where they gave him a book party. He had just won the Nobel Prize, and his collected stories were just coming out. And Farrar Straus, Roger Straus, who was the head of Farrar Straus, gave him a book party. So at this book party, he's seated at a table, signing copies of his book. And he says to me that this very sort of, well put together woman came up to him for a book. And for some reason, he got in his mind that she was a writer, a struggling writer, or an emerging writer. So he wrote in the book, keep plugging away and one day success will be yours. And it turns out it was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. That's the kind of guy. I don't know if they were true stories or not, they made them. At that time, I don't know how many remember, but Time magazine had this cover piece saying, Miami, Paradise Lost, with a big question mark. That was back in the early 80s. After Isaac Singer, we were able to have readings with people like Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, Susan Sontag came to the store. I remember being introduced to a guy who was very shy. I don't think he'd even published yet in this country, but it was Ronaldo Arenas, the famous Cuban writer, who had just come over from Mariel 2 years before and was just moving back to Miami. We also, at the time, always had photo exhibitions. And we did exhibitions with people like William Crispin Barry and Jerry Ullsman and others up in our gallery space. And the local community was growing too. The local writing community was growing too. The work of Charles Willeford, who wrote Miami Blues, was being rediscovered at the time. And then people like Les Standiford were coming to town and starting the FIU writing program with James W. Hall. As Les said, Carl Hyacin was just emerging. And Dave Barry, the great Dave Barry, was relatively unknown at that time. He wasn't even living in Miami, but his work was beginning to be recognized. And they were all beginning to kind of emerge on the national scene. Not too long after I opened, about 2 years after we opened, I get a call from Eduardo Padron at Miami-Dade College downtown. Eduardo is one of the great visionaries here in Miami. At the time, he was the president of that campus, the downtown campus of Miami-Dade College. And he said, look, you know, I hear that there's a bunch of people downtown I was doing something in Coral Gables, this festival of books and writers, and why don't we all get together and think about doing a big book fair downtown? And downtown at the time was Nowheresville. There was nothing going on downtown. And Eduardo had this vision of using the book fair to bring attention to downtown Miami. And he threw the weight of the college behind us. And here we were, you know, literally, it was like a Mickey Rooney movie, you know, let's start a book fair. We had no idea what we were really doing. I remember calling up publishers at the time. I'd only been a bookseller for 2 years. I'd call up publishers and I'd say, look, we want to get this author coming down. And they'd go, look, you know, we got this new non-prescription drug book out. We'll be happy to send that author down. I mean, they thought it was only old people, only beach reading. I had no idea that, you know, we wanted the best down here in Miami. And I was confident that that could happen. I knew the audiences were here because I was selling as sophisticated an audience as anybody else, anywhere in the country. So I was very, very confident that the Miami Book Fair could succeed because of the reading public here. The very first year, we were able to get James Baldwin came. He came an hour late, but he came. Here's the story about James Baldwin. He was on a plane from Paris to Miami. James Baldwin was a bit of a drinker. But he was on this plane. He missed the Miami stop and ended up in Fort Lauderdale, which was the next stop. So a car had to zip him over to Miami, and you know he came in while the speaker right before him was ending. Fortunately, he came. But it was a thrill to have him there. But some of the names of writers who are no longer with us, you know, who we had at those very first book fairs, were people like Norman Mailer was there, came, Saul Bellow, Joseph Heller, Jerzy Kosinski, Ken Kesey, Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet, was there. Bless you. We did a reading with the three living at the time Nobel Prize winning poets, Miłosz, Brodsky, and Octavio Paz, all at one reading. It was phenomenal. It was like chilling to be there. We were able to get iconic people like Hunter Thompson even, you know, came to this book fair. Nobody can understand a word of what he said when he came. The great story with him is that... Did he survive? Well, this is what happened with him. I had Hunter Thompson. First of all, what happened was he was due to come on Tuesday night. He never showed up on Tuesday night. He showed up Sunday morning. I don't know how that quite happened. He showed up Sunday morning. We had to find a space for him in the auditorium. We did. He needed to go to the bathroom for a little while. So I took him into the bathroom. I stepped outside. I all of a sudden heard like pounding on the walls. He was either banging his head against the wall or pounding. I don't know what he was doing. He comes out all refreshed looking. He came out, he goes on stage, and he proceeds to kind of disrobe a little bit, took his shirt off, and then he asked the audience if anyone in the audience had any wild turkey. He needed some alcohol. So it was a Sunday in downtown Miami. And fortunately, someone in the audience did. I don't know how they knew it was, I guess it's the Hunter Thompson crowd. So they came rushing to the stage. Oh, the funniest thing was the guy asked to introduce Hunter Thompson came stoned. I guess he figured he was just going to get into it in some way. He was a professor at Miami-Dade College. I was like, what are you doing? Anyway, so Hunter Thompson comes up, and this guy gives him a bottle. And he starts dousing himself all over. Couldn't understand a word. I'm like, what's going on here? The audience loved him. And the last thing I saw of Hunter Thompson was these guys who gave him that bottle, believe it or not, had a fishtail Cadillac convertible. And Hunter Thompson was in the back of that convertible with his legs sticking straight up. And I said, Jesus, I don't know what we're going to be liable for, but we're going to be liable for something. But, you know, ironically, through those kinds of things, I learned a whole lot. Like, I learned something that you never would imagine. Hunter Thompson and Dolores Kearns Goodwin were very close friends. Doris Kearns Goodwin, who wrote The Team of Rivals and all that, they were close friends because they were both journalists in Washington together. She happened to be at the fair this year, so she watched out for Hunter and told me the next day that Hunter showed up in her hotel room and slept on the floor and that he was okay. So I felt good about it. But so the Miami Book Fair has developed over the years. This year will be our 29th Miami Book Fair. We have probably presented over 5,000 authors at the Miami Book Fair. There are very few authors you can name who have not been at the Miami Book Fair. It's kind of a really remarkable event. And from the Miami Book Fair, other book fairs started developing all over the country. There's an LA Times book fair, there's one in Seattle, there's one all over the place. So, now I get people who come into the bookshop. Our bookstore is 30 years old now. I get people coming up saying they grew up at the Miami Book Fair. They got, they got their love of books by meeting a young writer at the Miami Book Fair. Or they got caught up in the fight with Leo Buscaglia, the Love Doctor. Do you remember Leo Buscaglia, the Love Doctor? Well, here's a guy who wrote a book about how to be respectful to one another, how to love one another. There was a riot at his event. There were too many people trying to get into the auditorium for him. And actually, Eduardo at that time got punched by somebody who was trying to keep him. We couldn't get him up the escalator. But there are all kinds of these kinds of stories that happened at the book fair. But during that time, during this 30 years, we opened the second store on Lincoln Road in 1989. I don't know how many of you have been on